In this SwiftUI series, we will look into how to create an app that enables us basic graphic editing capabilities. Think of it as a mobile version of Photoshop. But before we get to the final project, we will start very slowly. So if you have a look at this basic example app, you can see we have these cards and they're kind of stacked on top of each other. Now there are many ways you can interact with these layers. You can just move them around like this, or you can double tap, for example, on the green layer to get it all the way to the foreground. But for example, if you wanted to have that blue layer in front of that orange layer, you can also use this nice navigator that we have. So all I would do is drag this blue card and move it above the orange layer. So it's right where we want it. This is the first feature we need for such a graphic editor, but later on we will add more and more features to it. So I hope you will enjoy this tutorial, and make sure you subscribe so you will stay tuned when the next tutorial comes out. And also use the comments if you have any questions throughout this tutorial. So without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, open up Xcode and create a new project. Now you would usually select single view app, but since I'm running the latest Xcode beta version, it got renamed to app. So don't worry if it's named differently for you. So name it however you want. I will just call it SwiftUI Shop. Also make sure that the interface is selected to SwiftUI and the language to Swift. Continue by pressing next. Save it wherever you want. I will save it into my developer folder. Let me close this window quickly. Alright, open up content view and try to get the automatic preview to resume. Now in this case the iPod Touch is chosen, but it really doesn't matter. But I would like to see it on an iPhone 11, so I will change the simulator to it and also zoom out a bit so we can better see it. Alright, so let's get started. So let's start by creating the layer view. Now inside of this layer view, I will initially just return a rectangle. Just like so. And we will then call this layer view for now inside of the content view. Let's try to reload the automatic preview. Alright. Let's also give it a frame. I will give it a width of 300 and a height of 400. We don't need the alignment here. Okay, let's also make it rounded, so I will add a corner radius of 20. Maybe also a shadow with a radius of 10. Nice, so now we have this rounded rectangle that basically represents one of our layers, but if you try to run it, you will see that you're right now not able to move it around. So this is the next thing we're going to do. We want to be able to move this around. So for that, I'm going to create a state property first. So let's call this state, let's make it private. Let's call it drag offset. And I will give it a CG size of 0. Alright, so whenever this rectangle is dragged, we have to obviously reset our drag offset, and based on the drag offset, we will change the position of the rectangle. So this is how it works. Let's first add a gesture to it. It's going to be a drag gesture. And that drag gesture has a modifier called onChanged. And in this onChanged, let me first close the right bar. Right, so inside of this onChanged modifier, we also get a drag value. And we're going to use this value to set our drag offset. So our drag offset is going to be the value.translation. And actually now we only have to change the position based on this drag offset. So to do that, all we have to do is after, this is important, you have to do it after the frame. Pass it the offset based on this drag offset. So the x coordinate will be the drag offset dot width, and the y coordinate will be the drag offset dot height. All right, let's see what we got so far. So press resume. And as you can see, we can move around the card now. But there's one issue. You will notice when I move it to the left bottom corner and then I try to move it again, it will jump back to the middle and continue its movement from there. So why is this happening? The best way to illustrate what's happening is this nice example that I found. So initially, when we move our card to the bottom left corner, what's happening is the CG size value will be with a negative width and a positive height. So we will be here. And the next time we basically try to move this card, what happens is it jumps back to the origin point, and although we are moving it from here, what actually happens is it imagines it's moving from here. So what we have to do instead is we also need to keep track of the last location where the card was. So this is what we're going to do. So let's get back to the code for that. I'm going to introduce another state property, and I will simply call this one the last position. And what we have to do now is we have to say the offset is not only the drag offset width and drag offset height that we get from the origin, but it will be also based on the last position. So we have to do last position dot width plus drag offset width for the offset of the x coordinate, and similarly for the y coordinate, it will be the last position dot height plus the drag offset height. Now this is obviously not enough. What we also have to do is set the last position, because we're not doing it anywhere yet. And the way we're going to do it is there's also a modifier on the drag gesture that is called onEnded. And inside of here we also get a value very similar to the onChanged, and we will simply set the last position dot width by incrementing it plus equals the value dot translation dot width. Similarly for the the last position dot height, it will be the value dot translation dot height. There's one more thing we have to do, which is to reset the drag offset. Remember, when we move it here, the drag offset is changed, but since our new origin is the last position, there should be no drag offset from here. So the way we do this is by simply saying drag offset is equal to .0. Now let's try it one more time. Now if we move it around to the bottom left corner and we move it again, as you can see, there's no real jumping happening. Perfect, so now we can continue. Next, we want to create a model that can be used to initialize this view through the view model. So to do that, I will create a struct. And our struct will have a ID, which has to be unique. So I will just use a UUID, which is always unique when it's initialized. Also, the layer needs to have a name. So we will provide it when this is initialized as a string. Also, it would be nice if the layer has a background color. So like this. Yes, and one nice thing that I would also like to have is in the case that the user doesn't provide a name, it would be nice if we could do something like layer 1, layer 2, or name it based on the layer number that we currently have. To do that, we will need to have a layer counter. And every time this is used, we have to increment it somehow. So for that, we need some kind of static function. I will call it assign next layer name. And this obviously returns a string, like so. And the first thing we have to do is, as I said, we have to increment the layer counter. So we will do layer counter is equal to plus equal 1. And then we return the following name for it. So it's going to be layer and followed up with the layer counter. Lastly, we have to create an initializer. We have a background color here that we are going to initialize, and the name. And here we will have a default setting. So when the name is not provided, we will just simply assign it. And here we can simply say the background color is equal to the background color, and self.name is equal to name. Perfect. Now let's also create a view model. But before you do so, let me first comment the separate parts of our code. So this is going to be part of the model. Remember, usually you would create a separate file for this, but I always try to make it easy for you to follow. So that's why I have everything in one file for now. So this is our view, and now we will have a look at our view model. I will call my view model Graphics Editor, and it's obviously going to be an observable object because we're going to use it later on in this view. And this graphics editor will have a property that is also published, so every time this is changed, the view should also synchronize to it. So that's why we have this published key. So we call it layers, and let's just create some temporary layers for now so we can see how this looks on the view. Let me just paste this in here. All right. Now let's try to access this view model inside of our main view, which is our content view. We also have to rename this later on, but I will leave it like this for now. So make sure you use the add observed key. So it's the add observed object, and then just call it editor and initialize it with the view model we just created, which is graphics editor. Now inside of this content view, we can access the property which gives us all layers. So let's try to see how it looks now. So let's create a Z stack in here instead of directly showing the layer view. Inside of this Z stack, I would also like to change the background color so it looks more like a regular background color that we have in Photoshop, for example. I will give it an opacity of 0.2. Let's resume the automatic preview and see if everything is fine so far. Okay, cool. Also, I don't want the edges here, so basically the safe area, so we can easily get rid of these by saying edges, ignoring safe area, and then remove the top one and the bottom one. Nice. So in here we can create our for each loop like so. And the data is going to be our editor.layers. And for the content, so in here we have the layer. So we can now use the layer model to initialize our layer view. Oh, we also forgot to make sure that the layer view can be initialized using the model. So what we have to do is just simply create a property called layer, just of type layer. And then we can simply pass it in here, just like this. Now, whenever we iterate like this, we have to make sure that we provide the ID, so we have to uniquely be able to identify them, and that's how we do this. Now it should work. Let's try to run it again. Now, it can occasionally happen that your preview doesn't work, so try to just use the simulator. So if we run it here, we will also be able to see it. As you can see, it actually runs. So what you can do is, there's one thing we forgot. As you can see, all of these cards have a black background. To fix this, all we have to do is move back to our layer. I'm sorry, I meant the layer view. And here we have to make sure that we also pass fill color. So we will fill it with the layer dot background color, and that should fix it. Let's try it one more time. So yeah, now we have all colors that we expect. Now it would be nice if we double tap on one of these layers, that it pops to the top, and that's actually what we're gonna do now. So let's go back to Xcode and to the content view, and in here where we have the layer view, we can actually pass the modifier on DragGesture. It will take a count, which basically tells us when it should execute. So we want it to happen with a double tap. And the code we're going to perform is based on what card is on the top. Now, since we have our layers in an array, the card or the layer that is on the most top is also the last in the array. So what we have to do is check the following condition. If card.id is not equal to the editor.layers.last.id. Now in here it's fine to force-cast because we're pretty sure that there's always gonna be layers, because we just have this array here, and obviously there's always this last element. Let me first check this area. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not card, it is layer. Okay, so now we can say if let the index of that card with the ID, so editor the layers dot first index where the ID is equal to the card.id, so that way we can just get out the index that we're interested in. And in here we can basically do the moving of the layer. So I'm sorry, I'm always using card, but it should be obviously a layer. Okay, so here we can then say editor.layers.move from an offset to the offset, which is a function we have on all Swift arrays. It will need an index set, so let's give it an index set with we can initialize it with an integer, which is going to be our index, and the offset is going to be the editor.layers.count. So wanted to pop the layer that got double tapped all the way to the foreground. So let's try and see if this worked. See, as we double tap, for example, on the blue layer, it jumps all the way to the foreground just as we want it. Nice. So there's one thing we still need. Obviously, to have the black layer on top of the green layer would be really painful. You have to find the right combinations of double tapping. And that's where we introduce the layer navigator here at the bottom. So for that, let's go back to the code. Now our layer navigator is also going to be a view, so we will put it right here. Let's call this layer navigator, which is of type view. Obviously also has a body. Let's just for now return some text. Okay, so this layer navigator has to have access to all our layers. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to pass it through the content view. So from the content view, we pass this over to the layer navigator. So for that, the layer navigator needs a property called layers, which takes the binding of type layer array. And what we also need is a callback function that we can later use as a modifier. So every time someone moves a layer on top of another layer, the content view should get notified, and it should tell the view model to do this moving or replacing of layers. So make sure that you create this property called onChange, and it will take an index set and an integer and return void. Also make sure you make it optional. And then in the initializer, we can start initializing the layers. Make sure you call the binding keyword here. And then in here we can say self.layers is equal to layers. Next, we can create the a list in here. So let's do this. So our list will have a horizontal stack first, which is going to be the description, where it simply has this burger icon, if you remember the demo, and to the right of it, the title layers. So let's do that. Let me just paste this in here. So yeah, so this is the title, and then we have a spacer, and to the right of this, we also have this indicator that tells the user that he also could have the option to move around this layers navigator menu around the screen. Let's also give it a font. I'll also just paste this in here. You can choose any font you like. In this case, I would also like the foreground color to be white, and the list row background to be of blue with an opacity of 0.7. And yes, you can play around with this with these numbers and figure out what looks better to you. But yeah, this is what I have for now. And now what we have to do is create a list of these layers. But there's one issue we have to face. The problem we have with the layers is in the array, they are in an order that is not intuitive to the user, because in Photoshop, it's the way that the most bottom layer is all the way at the bottom. So the background layer is all the way at the bottom, and the layer that is in the foreground is above it, like more to the top. So to make it more readable to the user, we are going to use a more intuitive order, and for that we have to make sure that we take the layers and reverse the order. But since this is a binding, to actually access the layers, we have to use the wrapped value property to get the actual layer array. And once we have this array, we can say reversed. And as always, we have to identify them using this ID. And in here we have the layer. Now we can create the text. So I will simply say it's layer.name. Let's also give it a custom font, like so. And every time one of these layers is moved around, we want to execute this modifier on move. We can either do it like this, or we can simply create a function which would make it more readable. So I will simply say it's called move, and this obviously doesn't exist yet, this function. We will create it later on, but let's continue for now. Make sure that the list row background is clear, so it uses the clear color. Let's also set the frame to this for this navigator. Actually, let's first create this move function, because otherwise we won't get the auto completion. So let's make it private. It has to have the two things. So it has to have an index set and an integer, so the source and the destination. So from offset source, just an index set, to offset destination, which is an integer. And in here we do the magic. But yeah, for now you have to know only that this is executed every time the user decides to drag a layer around in the navigator. Yeah, okay, so we got this, and now we can set the frame, and that frame we will set on the list like this, and it will have a width of UI screen .main.bounce.width. We will also subtract it by an offset of 40, so it's not all the way to the edges, to the left and right. The height, we will just simply make it dependent on the number of layers we have. So let's create a CG float out of the number of layers. And for each of these entries, we are going to multiply it by 60. So if you have two elements, the height will be 120. Also, we can set the alignment to center. Let's also make sure that this is fixed size. And lastly, the environment has to be set for the editing. So we always want it to be in the editing mode, so the user can easily drag the listed rows around easily. And the way we do that is by passing a constant with the active keyword. Okay, so this is all we pretty much have to do for the layout, but now we have to think about how we're gonna work with the issue when the user decides to drag around layers. This is why we initially introduced this property, if you remember, this callback property. What we will do is in here we will call onChange. And since it's an optional, don't forget the question mark, and we will pass it the source, so basically this here, and the index set, which is the destination. So every time the user decides to drag around the layers, this onChange is called, and since the content view can register to this callback, it can automatically tell the view model to change the order of the layers. There's one last thing we have to do in order to access it, just like here, for example, with the on-tap gesture, we have to provide a helper function. So let me do that above the move function. I will call this function on changing layers, and it will look like this. It has to be escaping. Let me first write it down, and then we will have a closer look at this. All right, so as I told you earlier, the reason why we're doing all of this is so we can easily add something similar like this on-tap gesture to the layer view. But in our case, it won't be called on-tap gesture, it will be called on-changing layer. Actually, let's call it changing layers like this. All right, now we can continue. But before we do so, I would also like to make the list not scrollable. And to do that, all we have to do is go back to the initializer and say UI table view dot appearance dot scroll enabled, and set this to false. All right, so let's start using this layer navigator, and for this we will go back to the content view, our main view, and in here we will introduce another VStack just after the for each loop. So like this, and let's create some spacer in here, and here we will introduce our layer navigator. And our layer navigators takes the binding layers, and the way we pass it is use the $symbol editor.layers like that. And now we can use the modifier we just created. As you can see, it is the first one. It takes an index set and an integer, and it's called every time the layer navigator notices a change in the layers by the user. This is the destination. Okay, so now at this point we have to be able to modify the view model based on the change that we see here. But to do so, we have to still introduce this function in the view model. So let's go back to the view model. Okay, so in here I will create another function, and I will call it the move layers function, which takes an offset of type index set and destination of type integer. And I will just paste some code that I already created, but we will have a closer look at it later on. All right, so what this part of the code does is it tries to figure out based on remember the list we have in the layers navigator, it has the reversed order, so it's more readable to the user. So here we have to basically calculate the source and destination based on the reversed order of the reversed order, which is the literal order that our array here has. And based on this, if the user decides to move the black card to above the blue card, we know which location at the array that is, and also the actual destination in the layers array. So this is what's being done here. And now we will make sure that we call this whenever this callback is called in the content view. So right here. So what we do is say editor.move layers from offset, pass it the index set we got from the layer navigator, and also the offset. The destination. All right, let's run the code and see if it works. So here we have our layers. If we double tap on the blue layer, for example, it jumps all the way to the top. Let's see if this works. This works also. Perfect. So we're pretty much there where we wanted to be at the end of this tutorial. So if you like this tutorial, make sure you subscribe and also use the comment section if there are still any questions that I couldn't answer. And in the next tutorial, we'll try to look at further functionalities to get closer to the graphics editor. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you in the next part.